Hello, this is Little Green Ghouls, and welcome to Fear Street Explored, where your worst nightmares live. This week, I'm excited to visit The Knife. This is one of the wilder Fear Street books we've seen so far, and it contains multiple deaths, which I always appreciate. It spends a nice mix of time on Fear Street itself, and we get our first look at Shadyside Hospital, that just so happens to have a brand new Fear Wing, where all sorts of chaos unfolds. It's definitely worth checking out if you haven't yet. I like this 1992 cover because it lets us know we're in for a hospital horror story and gives us a solid look at Laurie, our protagonist. I feel like Stine naming her Laurie is a reference to Halloween 2. That could also just be me, but let's check out the full blurb on the back. Quiet Hospital. Shh. There are a lot of things they want to keep quiet at Shadyside Hospital. In fact, just about every private room holds a private secret of its own. Poor Laurie Masters, the student volunteer, innocently happened to stumble onto the hospital's sickest secret of all. Laurie has seen too much, and now the doctors and nurses are taking a close look at Laurie. What they come up with is a deadly diagnosis. Laurie may not be sick, but she's getting a prescription anyways. A prescription for horror. Okay, now let's start the summary. The book opens with an introduction to Laurie Masters, and she's in the future. This is a classic Fear Street setup where we get a glimpse ahead into the story to entice the reader to keep on reading. Here we find Laurie desperately trying to escape some mystery man through the debris of a hospital under construction. She nearly escapes him, but at the end of the chapter, she finds herself snatched from behind as she thinks, "Where's the knife?" Which is fitting considering the title of this book. We then jump back to 1 week earlier and find Laurie talking to her best friend Skye. They're both summer volunteers at Shadyside Hospital, and Laurie's just been transferred to the children's floor. A nurse Wilton chases the girls back to work, and Laurie stops to check out the construction of a new hospital wing. We learn this $10 million addition is courtesy of local millionaires and historic Shadyside family, the Fears. Franklin Fear is a descendant of Simon Fear, whose burnt-up old mansion has been mentioned in a few of these books. The new hospital wing will be called Fear Wing, which does not seem appropriate for the setting. Laurie then hears a child crying and goes to check on him. The boy, Toby, is 3 years old and should be getting released soon after recovering from pneumonia. He won't talk to Laurie, so she starts to read him a book. When Nurse Wilton reappears and tells Laurie to stop wasting her time on him because he won't talk to anybody, she then again chases Laurie out of the room. Laurie mentions in passing that nurses can be grouchy because they're overworked, and throws in how her friend Myra Barnes, last seen in The Sleepwalker, has a grouchy nurse mom too. Laurie and Skye meet for lunch and discuss a hospital fundraiser where they're raffling off a red Mercedes-Benz to raise money for the Fear Wing. They then chat about dating, and we learn Laurie is currently with Andy Price, whose dad is mega rich and basically in charge of the hospital. But Laurie wants to dump him because she thinks he's too aimless in life, despite being in high school. Laurie wants to be a doctor, so she's ambitious and has goals to chase. Skye is a bit man-hungry and is constantly on the prowl for fresh meat. Her favorite thing to do is to accept multiple dates and cancel as she gets better offers. She's also in hot pursuit of the various men in the hospital, even though they're typically college-aged or older. One of these men, Rick Spencer, joins them for lunch. Rick is a fellow volunteer, but he's in college and considering going to medical school. There's some light flirting between Rick and Laurie. However, this gets interrupted by an announcement of a code blue in Toby's room, meaning little Toby is in cardiac arrest. This ends up being a false alarm because when Laurie bursts into Toby's room, she just finds grouchy Nurse Wilton trying to take blood from Toby, who is not cooperating, so Laurie heard the wrong room number. Nurse Wilton is pissed and chases Laurie off for the third time. Laurie comes across Toby's mom and overhears a nurse telling her that Toby can't leave today, but might be able to leave tomorrow. This prompts Laurie to sneak back into Toby's room again, so she can tell him that he's going to be going home soon. It's much later in the day now, so all the construction workers have left, but Laurie feels like she's being watched from the Fear Wing. She then catches a glimpse of Rick lurking around the Fear Wing and finds it suspicious for some reason. Later that night, Laurie's at home, reading from her personal library because we find out that she lives with her Aunt Hillary, and that she's loaded. Shocker though, they live in North Hills, not Fear Street. Laurie's parents were killed in a boating accident when she was young, so all she's ever really known is her aunt. The phone rings and Laurie thinks it's her aunt since it's already 10 o'clock and she has no idea where this woman is. Instead, she's met with the sound of an ambulance siren before the call gets disconnected. A few minutes later, she gets another call and ends up being Rick. He claims to have gotten her number from Skye and tried calling earlier, but the line was busy. Rick wants to take Laurie out on Saturday night, but she says maybe some other time. She then asks if he was in Fear Wing earlier, which he denies, and she thinks she can hear sirens in the background, like he could still be near the hospital. After Rick hangs up, she calls Skye and learns that she never gave Rick her number, so now she knows this boy's a liar. The next morning, Laurie gets to the hospital early to pick up a gift for Toby, but is shocked to find his room empty since it's too early for discharges. She briefly thinks he's dead before spotting him in the hallway with his mother, Miss Dean, and Rick. Rick and Miss Dean are having a very serious conversation, and Laurie's confused on how they know each other. Lori then lures Toby over to her with a teddy bear, where she learns from Toby that Miss Dean actually isn't his mom. Miss Dean calls Toby over, and he starts crying how he just wants to go home. This concerns Lori, but it's too late. Miss Dean scoops him up and hauls him away. Lori chats with Rick, who claims he was just giving Miss Dean directions to the nearest pharmacy, since she's new to Shadyside and just moved on to Fear Street. So, that's going to be our Fear Street connection for this one. Lori asks why he was at the hospital so late last night, which he denies. He then asks her on a date after work, which she denies. She notices a box on the counter of the nurse's station containing 3 surgical knives and heads back to Toby's room to pick up her backpack. As she's walking back into the main hallway, she spots Rick putting the knives back into his pocket, so now she thinks he's a liar and a thief. She tries to tell one of the nurses, but gets sent on an errand instead. Lori then spends the rest of the day running around the hospital worrying about Toby. She finally decides to investigate further by breaking the law and snooping around in his medical records. She gets his address and decides she's going to visit him under the pretext of selling a raffle ticket for the Mercedes-Benz. Lori is mostly worried about traveling to Fear Street alone, but she decides she's just going to be brave. She's currently in the record room directly behind the nurse's station and finds herself cornered by Nurse Wilton, who's doing paperwork at the desk. Nurse Wilton eventually catches her and wants to know why she's back there. Lori responds to this by just running away, causing Nurse Wilton to hop up and chase after her. Lori dives into a restricted elevator and crashes into some poor half-dead woman before being forced out on the next floor, which is also labeled restricted access. She's still trying to escape Nurse Wilton, so she takes off down this dark empty floor, trying to find a door that isn't locked. When she finally finds one that's open, she realizes where she is. Lori smells something odd and then notices she's standing right next to a partially dissected body because she's in the anatomy lab where the medical students practice. She looks around and sees an assortment of partially dissected bodies with various organs scattered all over the tables. In the few seconds she's been in the room, a janitor passes by and locks the door, causing Lori to stumble backwards in a panic directly into a skeleton. She then spins around and bumps into a dead body on the table before stumbling face to face with a severed head. Lori is having a rough couple minutes all of a sudden. She starts pounding on the door to be let out because she no longer cares if Nurse Wilton finds her. Lori eventually finds a deadbolt on the door and is able to flee the room, but nearly runs right into Nurse Wilton, who appears to be chatting with Raymond Price, her boyfriend Andy's dad. Lori thinks she's in big trouble now if Nurse Wilton went directly to the top of the food chain to complain, but they appear to be discussing something else besides Lori's HIPAA violation. Once the two return to the elevator, Lori's able to escape down a stairwell. Later that evening, she meets Sky, Andy, and a friend named Jim Farrow for pizza, where she tells them all about her little dead body adventure. She then invites them all to Fear Street with her to sell a raffle ticket. They're all reluctant to go, considering all this shit that's happened on Fear Street, but eventually agree. Once outside Toby's house, Lori and Sky can hear soft crying coming from inside the house. Miss Dean opens the door, looking like a disheveled, dirty mess. She agrees to buy a raffle ticket, but shuts the door in Lori's face as she goes to get her purse. Lori seizes the opportunity to sneak inside, where she notices the house appears to be barely lived in and filthy. She spots Toby on the stairs and is horrified to see he looks paler and thinner than he did just earlier that day. He's also crying like he doesn't recognize her when she approaches. Miss Dean appears and screams at Toby to get back to his room and then directs her rage towards Lori for just wandering into her house. She throws $1 at Lori and then throws Lori out the door. The next morning at the hospital, Lori has to meet with the head nurse and learn she's being transferred off the children's floor because Nurse Wilton filed some complaints about her. Lori decides her best bet is to apologize to Nurse Wilton directly and explain how she's worried about Toby being mistreated by his mother. After her shift, she waits outside the front of the children's wing trying to catch Nurse Wilton, but nearly misses her as she creeps into the fear wing. Lori is perplexed, besides just to wait for her to come back out so she can apologize, when she then sees Rick sneak into the fear wing also. 30 minutes pass before Lori can't wait any longer, so she decides to head into the fear wing too. It's very dark and a half-built mess, so Lori stumbles around bumping into half-built walls and tripping over bundles of wire. At one point, she nearly walks directly into an open elevator shaft. Lori decides she's had enough and goes to leave, but then stumbles over the dead body of none other than Nurse Wilton, who's lying there, eyes open with a surgical knife sticking out of her throat. Lori clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She continued to stare down at the body. There was no question that the nurse was dead. The blade of the surgical knife was completely buried in her throat. Only a few drops of red showed on her neck. The blade had sealed the wound and prevented the blood from spurting. The expression of surprise on Nurse Wilton's face would have been comical if she weren't so hideously, blankly dead. For a few seconds, Lori stood paralyzed in terror and disgust. Then she shook herself out of it and flew into action. Lori races out of the fear wing and soon has a team of nurses and security investigating the scene, except when they go to where Lori found the body, it's gone. Sky's there too, and she wants to know what the fuck Lori's problem is. Shit then gets stupid as one of the doctors says this must be an elaborate prank courtesy of another doctor, and Sky jumps in and says yes it was, so all the security nurses walk away thinking this was just some stupid joke. The doctor then pulls the girls aside and asks them not to say anything because he wants to prank another doctor back, so Dead Nurse Wilton has been dismissed as some stupid prank thanks to a random doctor in Skye. Lori knows what she saw and thinks Rick must have killed her. She also thinks all of this is somehow related to Toby and Mrs. Dean, so she plans to go snoop around his house on Fear Street some more. Before leaving, she decides to look more closely at Toby's medical records, but his file is now missing, and it's like he never came to the hospital at all. We then spend some time the next day with Lori summarizing this book so far to Skye during lunch. Then after work, Lori goes home and dresses in all black so she can creep around Fear Street. She parks her car down the road and ends up peering through the kitchen window of Toby's house. She's just in time to watch some random woman try her best to cheer up Toby, but he refuses to talk to her. Then this woman and a strange man load Toby up with his little suitcase into their car and drive away, all while Miss Dean watches without emotion. Lori tries to write down a license plate number, but it's too dark. She gets ready to leave, but can hear another child's cries coming from inside the house. It's starting to look like we have a twin situation for sure. Lori decides to review the plot once again, and concludes she'll need to chat with Andy's dad since he's in charge at the hospital and must know something about all this. She heads back to her car, but realizes she's being followed by an old blue Honda. She dives into the woods as it slowly drives past before she's able to sneak back to her car. Just before she's about to drive away though, the Honda comes flying up at her and Rick jumps out. He tries to talk to her, but Lori just races away from him. Once back at home, Lori calls Andy to see if his dad is home, but he's not, so she quickly hangs up on him. Lori really needs to dump Andy because it's clear she has zero interest in this guy. Lori hears the front door shut and thinks her aunt just got home. Lori shouts for her, but as the footsteps slowly creep up the stairs, it becomes apparent it's not her Aunt Hillary who's in the house. Lori dives for the phone, but is knocked to the ground in the process. The footsteps get closer, she scrambles under her bed, but at the last second, Aunt Hillary's car pulls up, which is enough to scare this mystery creeper out of the house and out the back door. Lori races downstairs and eventually tells her aunt everything about Toby and the dead body, but her aunt just assumes Lori's been working too hard and should go visit her grandparents in California to relax. We also learn that her aunt has been auditing the hospital the past few days, so there has to be some sort of money thing going on here related to all this. Lori blows up at her aunt for not believing her and says she's going to go talk to Andy's dad herself. She goes to bed but is woken up in the middle of the night by a phone call from Rick. He wants to know why she ran away from him on Fear Street, and she just launches into all of her suspicions. She demands to know why he stole the surgical knives the other day, and he says he was just sent down there on an errand to pick them up since he's volunteering at the surgery center. This appeases Lori briefly before she asks him why he followed Nurse Wilton into the Fear Wing and why he was on Fear Street. Rick goes quiet for a minute and then grimly warns her to stay away from Fear Street. The next morning, Lori meets Andy's father, and this doesn't result in a whole lot, other than this man is clearly in on whatever's happening in the hospital, because he pretends he never met with Nurse Wilton before. He's then outraged that nobody told him about dead Nurse Wilton, prank or not. He calls the head nurse, who informs him that Nurse Wilton is on a 3-week vacation that she scheduled a few months ago. He then promises to look further into Toby's home situation, and is going to try to get Lori rescheduled to the children's floor. Lori leaves the conversation relieved that at least someone is doing something. Andy meets her in the hallway and tries to give her a kiss, which she pushes away. He then wants to hang out that night and she rejects it. He's upset and wants to know if she's seen somebody else because she's always trying to avoid him, it seems like. He's not wrong. I don't think we've seen a single interaction so far where she isn't saying she's too busy to hang out with him or rejecting him in some way. It's usually the boyfriends in these books who aren't great, but Lori just needs to let this boy go because she straight up isn't into him. They end up having a blowout fight and she tells him to leave her alone permanently, which is teenage speak for breaking up, I assume. She ends up driving to the mall to meet Skye, and in the parking lot just so happens to spot Miss Dean and Toby. Toby has the bear Lori bought him and waves enthusiastically at her, but Miss Dean angrily scoops him up and speeds out of the parking lot. It's definitely twins going on here. When she tells Skye about the situation, she's fairly indifferent and much more interested in the potential Andy breakup because she wants to snatch him up. The teens of Fear Street have no problem dating their friends' exes. Is this common? I would never. Lori heads back home and makes sure to lock all the doors and windows in case somebody tries to break in again. It's storming out, so she has multiple moments where she thinks she hears somebody else in the house. That is, when she's not too busy repeating the plot to herself. She starts to think of Toby and impulsively decides to call Miss Dean to check on him. When Miss Dean answers, she's had enough of Lori and tells him to stop snooping around and to leave them alone. Toby starts crying for Lori in the background, and then Lori is certain she hears somebody smack him before the phone disconnects. Lori wastes no time and immediately races for her car. Things escalate quickly from here. Lori crawls into Mrs. Dean's kitchen window, but then stupidly bumps into a table full of dishes. As she's picking up the pieces, Miss Dean whacks her on the head from behind, causing her to fall unconscious. When she wakes back up, she's tied to a chair in the basement, and Miss Dean is doing an evil villain rant at her, where she says she told Lori to stay away and calls her a meddling fool, like a Scooby-Doo character. Miss Dean heads upstairs, and Lori can hear her on the phone telling somebody that she's the girl trapped in the basement, so they're gonna have to finish her off, and the aunt too. Laurie is now worried about getting Aunt Hillary killed and spots a pair of scissors on a nearby table. The basement door then opens and Laurie thinks she's about to be murdered, but this just ends up being Toby. He gets Laurie the scissors and she's able to break free. We then learn Toby has a twin brother, Terry, and he was the one that got taken away. Laurie decides she's taking Toby with her, so they sneak out the back door and race to her car. As she's driving away, Miss Dean opens the door and begins shouting at them. Laurie decides to stop at a payphone to call her aunt's house to warn her, but she doesn't answer, so she decides to call the hospital to see if she's working there on the audit. The operator informs her that everyone in accounting went home for the evening, but she does have a note from Aunt Hillary saying that her car won't start and she needs Laurie to come pick her up at the hospital. This is clearly a trap. However, Laurie doesn't have time to think about this too much because she hears a report on the radio stating that Nurse Wilton's body was found in a ravine off the Fear Street woods in an apparent car accident and that she must have been dead for a few days, so Laurie knows the accident has been staged. The excitement just keeps on coming for her though, because then she realizes Rick is following her in his blue Honda. She's able to race away from him, but as she's entering the hospital with Toby, she can see him pulling into the parking lot. For some reason, she leaves Toby with a nurse on the first floor and then races to the elevator to find her aunt on the children's floor. Just as the elevator's doors are closing, Rick spots her and beelines it for her. Lucky for Laurie, the elevator shuts at the last second. We are then treated to a full-on Scream-style chase scene as Laurie tries to reach her aunt at the nurse's station, but has to duck and hide as Rick enters the children's floor. She dashes through the hall until finally being forced into the Fear Wing to hide. She then crawls through the construction shit before noticing a trapdoor she can use to sneak down to the next floor, but before she can get to it, Rick enters the Fear Wing and begins calling for her. Laurie hides behind a tarp, and then we're in the middle of the opening chapter where Rick catches her from behind, and she wonders where the knife is he used to kill Nurse Wilton. Someone else enters the Fear Wing, so Laurie's able to break free from Rick and scream for help. There's a struggle in the dark, then Andy's dad, Mr. Price, tells Laurie it's safe to come out and turns on a flashlight. We have a silly moment where Laurie thinks Rick is dead on the floor with a knife in his back, but it ends up just being a design on his t-shirt. Mr. Price whacked him on the head with a flashlight though. Mr. Price tells Laurie to come with him, which we all know is a bad idea because he's obviously no good. Rick regains consciousness and warns Laurie that he was the one who killed Nurse Wilton because she'd been blackmailing him for running an illegal adoption ring from the hospital with Miss Dean and selling the kids to the highest bidder. Rick had been volunteering at the hospital because he'd been trying to locate his sister Beth, who was sold off. That's a lot to process. Mr. Price pulls out a gun and grabs onto Laurie. He holds her hostage and slowly backs away from Rick, right into an open elevator shaft. Mr. Price tumbles into the shaft, taking Laurie with him, but at the last second she's able to grab Rick's hand. He pulls her to safety, and then we cut to the emergency room as Laurie waits for her aunt. Laurie has a broken wrist, but is otherwise fine. We learn Mr. Price was getting ready to kill Aunt Hillary too, because she had stumbled across a secret hospital fund linked to Mr. Price, but she had no idea it was from selling children. The police are quickly locating all the stolen kids, and Rick's sister should be returned in a couple of hours. We then head for a classic Fear Street ending, as Rick asks Laurie out on a date, but she tells him not until he sells that stupid knife t-shirt. So, that's how this one ends. Laurie stopped a human trafficking ring, and is on her way to getting a new man. Overall, I thought the knife was a decent mystery with some fun twists and wild moments. I liked that Laurie was a very proactive protagonist, and had no issue investigating things quickly. Her boyfriend's dad being involved in some capacity was a little obvious, but I can't say I expected him to be selling children. Both Nurse Wilton and Mr. Price had gruesome deaths, which is always a positive in a Fear Street book, and Stine did a decent job of keeping Rick suspicious. Part of me was kind of hoping that all of this would just end up being a giant misunderstanding with Laurie breaking HIPAA for no reason. I'm going to give this one 5 out of 5 scalpels. I thought this book was a nice change of scenery, and it went in directions I didn't think it would. Okay, for Fear Street deaths, in the knife we had 2. These included Nurse Wilton getting stabbed in the throat and then tossed into a ravine, and Mr. Price, who fell 8 stories down an elevator shaft. This brings our Fear Street series total to 14 deaths. In Fat 90s Moments, we had just 3 this week. These included Tom Cruise, phone booths, and CDs. This brings our Fear Street series total to 74. For Useless Adults, we have just 1 with Aunt Hillary. She was a busy lady, but if your niece says she found a dead body, I think that warrants following up on. This brings our Fear Street series total to 16. What's your favorite scary movie finally returns from a long hiatus with a creepy siren phone call from Rick in the middle of the night that actually ends up being innocent? This brings our Fear Street series total to 9. Tainted Love is back again, and this ends up being Laurie and Andy, who spend the book clearly needing to end things because Laurie straight up doesn't like this boy, then his dad tries to kill her. This gives us a Fear Street series total of 13. Cheesy ending is debatable this week because Laurie and Rick flirt a bit on the final page, but it doesn't feel particularly egregious, like it didn't make me cringe. This leaves our Fear Street series total at 8. Well, that's it for the knife. our first Fear Street book to venture into hospital horror and human trafficking. Next week, we're looking at our fourth Give Yourself Goosebumps book, The Deadly Experiments of Dr. Eek. And it sounds like we'll be the guinea pig in some experimentation. Let me know in the comments what you thought of The Knife. Did you see the twist coming? When will we learn more about the Fear family lore? Did you like Laurie's shameless HIPAA violation? Also, what did you think of my hospital horror clips this week? I can hardly handle medical horror scenes, so clip hunting this week was unpleasant. Anyways, as always, thanks again for watching, and make sure you subscribe for
the pride, the love,